This is Dan Gritsko, and I am in Washington, D.C., looking at the west front of the U.S. Capitol, which commands the view here of the mall in Washington, D.C. And I want to take a minute and talk about our 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant. I have come to respect this man's role in history in the last year more than I had ever realized. General Grant was the commanding general who defeated Robert E. Lee to end the United States Civil War in April of 1865. This statue here and this memorial was dedicated in 1922, is primarily the work of Henry Shrady, who sadly died just a couple weeks before it was completed. But General Grant had quite an amazing story. He was from Galena, Illinois, and as he grew up as a young man, he ended up going to West Point. His dad got him a commission to go there. After he graduated, he ended up serving in the military, was involved in the Mexican War. He also was out west and very much missed his family, his wife Julia. He ended up leaving the military as a captain, and eventually he ends up being a clerk in his father's store. His father was an ardent abolitionist. His wife's parents were living on the side of a slave state. They owned slaves. So Grant was in a very unique position in history. As the war starts out in 1860, Grant tries to get a commission, eventually is able to do so, and then partway into the war, he becomes a general. And he leads the Union to some very big victories in the West. In fact, those victories would make him famous. He then suffers a pretty tremendous defeat in the Battle of Shiloh. Although he kept his wits and kept the army together, he's kind of put on the sidelines a little bit, and then President Lincoln is again looking for generals, and he puts Grant in charge, and he leads the brilliant campaign which eventually has the siege of Vicksburg, and with that ending has a tremendous victory. He's then put in charge of the Union Army, comes back to Washington, D.C., he gathers his troops, and in May of 1864, they head south to pursue Robert E. Lee, and they have this tremendous battle called the Wilderness near Fredericksburg. Terrible, terrible battle. Huge casualties on both sides. After the battle, Lee and Grant look at the casualties of their armies, but Grant does something different that Union generals had not done before. He decides, we're not going to turn back, we're going to keep going forward, we're on to Richmond. So that famous quote, Grant says, on to Richmond, and that electrifies the Union Army. He eventually continues to pursue Lee through a lot of different battles. He makes incredibly good decisions and some rough and bad decisions, eventually ending up in Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, where he offers a very gracious surrender terms to Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army. And on those grounds, the war ends. He says the greatest tragedy of his life was the night that President Lincoln was assassinated. He had hoped that Lincoln would be the one who could reunify the Union, and as Lincoln dies, Grant feels that that mantle falls upon him. As a person who works in the tour and travel industry, this particular spot here is where we take lots of photographs of the Capitol building. In fact, they've been taking photos here for decades. Many have not remembered the tremendous contribution of this man who became our 18th president. He had a lot of flaws, had some struggles in drinking and smoking, but his contributions in history have been enormous and need to be remembered. And to me, they inspire me, they make me realize that one man can make a difference. And Ulysses S. Grant certainly did. So when you come to Washington, D.C., take a moment to remember this incredible general, our 18th president, and this simple idea that one man can change the course of history.